Welcome back to Quran by AI. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling Surah 12, Joseph. It's known for being the longest single narrative in the Quran.
It really is remarkable how much this surah packs into a single, continuous story.
So where do we even begin with something this epic?
Well, the story starts off with a young Joseph and a very vivid dream.
Ah, yes, the dream. In verse 4, Joseph tells his father, Jacob, about seeing 11 stars, the sun and the moon, all bowing down to him.
Right, and it's Jacob's reaction that's so interesting here. You see, in verse 6, he recognizes how significant this dream could be, but he immediately warns Joseph not to tell his brothers about it.
Because he's worried about them being jealous.
Exactly. Verse 8 tells us Jacob knows his other sons, and he fears how they might react.
It almost feels like he senses the trouble this dream might bring.
I think that's a great observation.
Yeah.
And there's this phrase that pops up several times in the Surah Tasla al-Abid, usually translated as interpretation of events. You find it in verses 6, 21, and 101.
So you're saying it's not just about interpreting dreams.
Not exactly. It seems to point to something much bigger, like God is using these events to teach us all valuable lessons.
Interesting. So it's about understanding how these events fit into a larger plan.
Precisely. And if Jacob hadn't understood the potential consequences of the dream, who knows how the story might have unfolded?
Well, speaking of consequences, we see the brothers' jealousy take a dark turn in verse 9 when they plot to get rid of Joseph altogether.
And that's where things get really intense. One brother, some scholars believe it's Reuben, suggests throwing Joseph into a well instead of killing him outright. This is in verse 10.
Hoping someone might find him.
That's the idea. He's hoping a caravan passing by might rescue him. It's a pretty chilling moment, but it also shows us that not all the brothers were on the same page, you know?
Different levels of guilt, for sure. Now, what's interesting is how the Quran emphasizes the brothers' deception when they convince Jacob to let Joseph go with them. That's in verses 11 to 14.
Yeah, that's a key difference from the biblical account where Jacob actually makes that decision himself. Here in the Quran, the blame falls squarely on the brothers.
A subtle but important distinction. It definitely shapes how we see their characters, right?
Absolutely. Now, as the brothers are taking Joseph away, Jacob warns them about wolves being a danger. This is in verse 13.
I noticed that detail wasn't in the Bible.
Right, you won't find that there. But it does tie into Christian typology, where Joseph is often seen as the innocent lamb, and his brothers, well, they're the wolves.
Powerful imagery. And speaking of powerful moments, God speaks directly to Joseph when he's thrown down into that well. In verse 15, God reveals that he will expose the brothers' deceit.
It's such a crucial moment because it gives Joseph hope in what must have been a terrifying situation, right? It establishes this idea that God is aware of what's happening, even when it seems like everything is falling apart.
It's a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone.
Exactly. Now, of course, the brothers have to cover their tracks, so in verse 17, they present Jacob with Joseph's tunic, all covered in blood.
Trying to convince him that Joseph was killed by a wild animal.
Right, exactly. But Jacob isn't fooled. Verse 18 tells us he doesn't believe them for a second.
He knows his sons too well.
He certainly does. Now, the story shifts gears at this point, and we find Joseph being rescued from the well by a passing caravan. That's in verse 19. He's then taken to Egypt and sold into slavery, eventually ending up in the house of this powerful Egyptian official, referred to as Al-Aziz in verse 21.
I always found it fascinating that the Quran doesn't actually name Potiphar, who is the one usually identified with Al-Aziz in later Islamic tradition.
It's true. I mean, some scholars argue that it might be intentional, you know?
Yeah.
Leaving that detail out adds a layer of ambiguity.
Yeah, like it's pushing us to focus on these larger themes of power and temptation rather than getting bogged down in the specifics.
That's a really great point. Now, as Joseph grows up in this new environment, verse 22 tells us that God grants him wisdom and knowledge.
It really sets him apart. It's actually a key difference from the Bible, where Joseph's role as a prophet is less explicit.
Right. And that prophetic status is going to play a huge role in how Joseph responds to the challenges ahead. Speaking of challenges, verse 23 introduces us to the infamous Potiphar's wife who, well, she tries to seduce Joseph.
Such a classic tale of temptation. But Joseph resists her advances, and it really highlights his strong moral character. You know?
I completely agree. And what's really striking is how he resists her. He doesn't just say, hey, I'm loyal to your husband. In verse 24, he emphasizes his belief in God. It makes it clear that his actions are guided by something much bigger than just personal loyalty.
Right. He's operating from a higher moral code.
Yeah.
But things get even more complicated when he's actually accused of wrongdoing by Potiphar's wife.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where we see another interesting detail that's not found in the Bible. The Quran includes a whole trial scene in verses 25 to 29.
A trial.
Yeah. And the torn tunic becomes this crucial piece of evidence that actually helps to prove Joseph's innocence.
It's fascinating how the Quran incorporates these legal elements into the story.
Right. It adds this whole other dimension to the narrative, and it speaks to the importance of justice and truth.
So word about what happened starts to spread, and in verse 30 we see that rumors about Potiphar's wife and Joseph are making their way through the community.
And this is where things get a little crazy. Potiphar's wife, she decides to invite a bunch of other women over to her house. She wants to prove just how irresistible Joseph is.
So she has Joseph appear before all these women in verse 31, hoping to show them how captivating he is.
Right. It's a pretty dramatic scene, and the women, they're so taken aback by Joseph's appearance that they accidentally cut their hands while they're preparing fruit. They completely lose their focus.
Wow. What's interesting is that the Quran leaves it kind of ambiguous whether this incident is what directly leads to Joseph's imprisonment.
Yeah, that's true. We're not told for sure if he's imprisoned because of this event or if something else happens that we're not privy to.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how much control do we really have over the course of our lives?
Definitely. And the story doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
So we find Joseph in prison now, as described in verse 36, and it's there that he encounters these two young men, a baker and a wine carrier.
And it's through them that his gift for interpreting dreams really comes to light.
It's almost like his prison sentence becomes this opportunity for his abilities to be recognized.
Right, and it sets the stage for his eventual encounter with Pharaoh. But before we get to that, there's a really important moment in verses 37 and 38. Joseph delivers this incredibly powerful statement of faith where he rejects polytheism and affirms the religion of his forefathers.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Exactly. It establishes Joseph as a monotheistic preacher, even while he's imprisoned. And, it really resonates with later Islamic tradition that emphasizes his role as a prophet.
That's fascinating. So he interprets the dreams of the baker and the wine carrier, accurately predicting what will happen to them.
Yes. He tells the baker that he will be executed and the wine carrier that he will be released. You can read that in verse 41. And it's this act that eventually paves the way for him to interpret Pharaoh's dreams.
Ah, yes, the famous dreams of Pharaoh. In verse 43, we're told he sees these 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 lean ones and 7 green ears of grain alongside 7 withered ones. Pretty bizarre, right?
Very symbolic. And none of Pharaoh's advisors can figure out what they mean.
That's when the former wine carrier remembers Joseph. In verse 45, he suggests that Pharaoh summon him from prison to interpret these strange dreams.
And it's a real turning point for Joseph. Even though he's still in prison, he confidently interprets the dreams in verses 47 to 49, predicting 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine.
It's a remarkable display of his wisdom and, honestly, his courage, too. To stand before Pharaoh, even as a prisoner, and deliver such a powerful message.
It really is. And what's interesting is that the Quran doesn't actually say outright whether the dream came true. Well, the focus isn't on the literal fulfillment of the dream itself. It's more about how this interpretation leads to Joseph's release from prison and his rise to power in Egypt.
I see what you mean. It's not about proving the dream right, but about how it changes Joseph's life. Now, there's this mysterious passage right before Joseph's release in verses 52 and 53.
Oh, yes. The passage where it's not entirely clear who's speaking.
Exactly. Some scholars think it's Potiphar's wife confessing her feelings for Joseph, even after all that's happened.
And others think it could be Joseph reflecting on the nature of temptation and how our souls can sometimes be drawn towards evil.
It's open to interpretation, which is part of what makes it so intriguing.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity to the story and invites us to think about things from different perspectives.
And just when we think things can't get any more dramatic, Joseph's brothers arrive in Egypt in verse 58. They're looking for food.
And the irony is thick. Joseph recognizes them immediately, but they have no idea who he is.
That's in verse 59, right? What a powerful moment. It sets up this whole series of encounters that are just filled with dramatic tension.
Absolutely.
It's almost too perfect, right? Like, talk about divine intervention.
And what makes it even more fascinating is that Joseph, even though he knows who they are, he plays along.
He doesn't reveal himself right away. Why not?
Well, it seems like he has a plan. Remember, he's not just a dreamer anymore. He's wise, He's resourceful, and he's learned to be
That
cautious.
makes sense. He's been through a lot.
Exactly. He's not going to just jump into a reunion without knowing what kind of men his brothers have become. So in verses 60 to 61, he gives them provisions, but then he makes this interesting demand. He tells them they have to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, with them on their next trip if they want more food.
It's like a test, isn't it? He wants to see how they'll treat Benjamin, how they've changed since their last encounter.
It definitely has that feel to it. Now, this part of the story mirrors the biblical account pretty closely, but there are some subtle differences in how it's portrayed.
Such as?
Well, the Quran seems to present Joseph as a bit less harsh in his dealings with his brothers. For example, he doesn't accuse them of being spies, which is what happens in the Bible, and he even secretly returns their money to them, showing a kind of hidden compassion.
It makes you wonder why the Quran might portray Joseph in this way.
It's an interesting question. Some scholars suggest that it might be to emphasize his mercy, even towards those who wronged him, or maybe it's to foreshadow the eventual reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're seeing a more nuanced side to his character, one that's capable of both justice and forgiveness.
Exactly. So the brothers, they eventually do return to Egypt with Benjamin, as you can read in verse 70. And now the stage is set for one of the most dramatic moments in the entire surah.
Lay it on me.
Well, first, Joseph does something incredibly touching. He secretly reveals his true identity to Benjamin in verse 69. It's a detail you don't find in the Bible.
Oh, wow. So they share this secret bond now, the two of them.
Yeah, it's a beautiful moment. But then things take a turn. See, Joseph concocts this plan involving a missing cup.
A missing cup.
Yep, you can read about it in verses 70 to 76. He orchestrates it so that this cup ends up being found in Benjamin's bag.
But why?
It seems like he wants to create this situation, this crisis, to see how his brothers will respond. Will they protect Benjamin, or will they abandon him just like they abandoned Joseph all those years ago?
What a test of their character.
It really is. And the way they react is incredibly revealing. They're frantic. They're desperate to return Benjamin safely to their father. In fact, in verse 78, they actually offer themselves in Benjamin's place. They're willing to become slaves themselves if it means their youngest brother can go free.
Wow. That's a huge change from how they acted before. They've clearly grown. They've developed a sense of responsibility and compassion.
It's a powerful testament to their transformation. But what makes this even more complex is that the Quran explicitly states in verse 76 that God orchestrated these events.
So it raises that age-old question. Free will versus divine decree.
Exactly. Did the brothers choose to act this way, or was their behavior predetermined by God?
Oh, yeah, and that's a tough one.
It really is. It's one of those mysteries that theologians have debated for centuries, and the Quran doesn't offer any easy answers. It's inviting us to grapple with these complexities, to think deeply about the interplay between human choice and divine will.
I guess sometimes the most important questions are the ones that don't have simple solutions.
Absolutely. And as the brothers plead for Benjamin's release, they reach a breaking point. They can no longer bear the weight of their past, the guilt of what they did to Joseph. So in this moment of desperation, they finally confess their sin. That's in verses 88 and 89.
It's like the truth finally comes pouring out.
It really does. It's this incredible moment of catharsis, not just for the brothers, but for Joseph, too. He can finally reveal his true identity to them. You can read that in verse 90. And the reaction is immediate. The brothers are overwhelmed with fear and remorse.
They must have been terrified. I can't even imagine the emotions they were going through.
It must have been incredibly overwhelming for everyone involved. But what's remarkable is how Joseph responds.
How does he react?
Well, instead of condemning them, instead of dwelling on their past betrayal, he comforts them. He emphasizes God's mercy and forgiveness in verse 92. It's a powerful moment that highlights the transformative power of forgiveness, both for the one who gives it and the one who receives it.
It reminds me of that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
That's a good one. And this is where we see the true depth of Joseph's character. He's not just wise and resourceful, he's also incredibly compassionate. He understands that his brothers were instruments in God's plan, even if they didn't realize it at the time.
So he doesn't punish them. He doesn't seek revenge.
Nope, he forgives them. And to show the sincerity of his forgiveness, he sends them back to Canaan with his shirt, instructing them to place it on their father's face, believing it will heal Jacob's blindness. This is in verse 93.
It's almost like a symbol of healing, isn't it? Both physical and emotional.
That's a great way to put it.
And as they travel back, Jacob senses them coming, saying he smells the scent of Joseph. Verse 94. But his sons think he's just getting old, like in verse 95.
They don't believe him.
But then, in verse 96, they put the shirt on Jacob's face, and his sight is restored. Talk about a miracle, a testament to faith, forgiveness, and family.
And this healing goes beyond just the physical. Jacob's being released from the darkness of his grief. He can finally see clearly again.
And this leads to a joyful reunion, setting the stage for the final chapter of the story. The whole family is brought together in Egypt. Good triumphs over evil, and love and forgiveness prevail. So we left off with that incredibly moving reunion between Jacob and his sons. His sight was miraculously restored. What a powerful moment of healing.
It really emphasizes God's power and mercy, and from here we see the story move towards this grand finale, the whole family reunited in Egypt.
Joseph, back in Egypt, is waiting for them. He's been through so much, but now he's finally going to see his father again.
And verse 99 describes this reunion so beautifully. Joseph arranges everything for his family, makes sure they're comfortable and safe. It really shows his generosity.
He's always been like that, always choosing kindness, despite everything he's endured.
It's a stark contrast to the fear and jealousy we saw in his brothers. Then there's this incredibly symbolic moment in verse 100. Joseph raises his parents up to the throne, and it's more than just respect, right?
It's a complete reversal of the power dynamics. The past is the past.
He wants them to be equals, share in his success.
Rebuild their family on this foundation of love and forgiveness.
And how do the brothers react? The same verse tells us they bowed down before him, acknowledging his elevated status. It's a sign of their transformation, don't you think?
Completely different from how they acted before. The ones who wanted to harm him are now bowing before him, recognizing his success and his faith. And in this moment, Joseph reminds them about God's plan, recounting his childhood dream, the 11 stars, the sun and moon bowing down to him. Verse 100.
It's like he's saying, even the most painful experiences can lead to something greater.
If we trust in God's wisdom and timing. And in verse 101, Joseph expresses his gratitude to God for everything. He acknowledges God's guidance and protection.
A testament to his faith and humility, despite his success.
So the surah ends with this image of unity, forgiveness, and trust in God.
The last few verses of Surah 12, they make us think about the nature of revelation and learning from these stories of the prophets.
So in verse 104, it states that Prophet Muhammad isn't seeking a reward for delivering this message. His only mission is to guide people, to enlighten them.
Yeah, it emphasizes that the Quran is a source of wisdom and guidance for everyone.
Okay, and then in verse 105.
It highlights this really important truth.
Yeah.
That there are so many signs around us, in the heavens and on earth, all these signs pointing to God's existence, his power. But still, so many people ignore them.
It reminds us to pay attention, doesn't it? To really look at the world around us, to ponder all of those wonders of creation, and to recognize that there's this divine presence in our lives.
Exactly. It brings us to this topic of disbelief.
Right.
And the consequences that come with it. Verse 106, it warns against associating partners with God, which is such a core belief in Islam. It's a call to embrace the oneness of God, to understand that real peace, real fulfillment, it only comes through submitting to God.
And then these last verses of Surah 12, they offer this message of hope, this reassurance for those who believe.
Right, like a guide through all of life's challenges.
So in verse 110,
it emphasizes that God's always there, offering his support to those who sincerely seek it. No matter what we're going through, we're never alone. God is always with us.
And then finally, verse 111, it concludes by affirming the Quran's authenticity.
It's a source of guidance, mercy, wisdom for everyone.
I think what's so powerful about this story of Joseph, as it's told in Surah 12, it's more than just a captivating tale. It's this deep exploration of who we are as humans, our faith, this idea of a divine plan.
It offers all these timeless lessons about forgiveness, resilience, family, and how good ultimately triumphs over evil.
I love how it encourages us to reflect, to look at our own lives, to recognize those signs of God all around us.
Absolutely, and to seek guidance from a higher power as we try to find meaning and fulfillment in our own journeys.
I think that's a perfect place to end our deep dives into Surah 12. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, faith, perseverance, doing what's right, they can lead us to a much brighter future.
It's a story for everyone, really, offering wisdom and hope to anyone who seeks it.
Thanks for joining us today on Quran by AI, and we'll see you next time.